Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here, and congratulations to the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. It's a wonderful initiative, and I wish it success. It is sorely needed. Right, the subject of my talk is why has the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Arab and Muslim countries been suppressed? Now, in February of this year, the UN did something unprecedented. It published a report acknowledging that Jews have been driven out of Yemen. In fact, there are still 7 Jews. One is in jail on trumped-up smuggling charges, but there is no denying that this 3,000-year-old community is extinct. Elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa, excluding Iran and Turkey, ancient Jewish communities are in their death throes. Until the 17th century, most Jews lived under Muslim rule. In 1939, Baghdad was more Jewish than Warsaw or New York. 33% of its residents were Jews. In 1948, 1 million Jews lived in the region. Barely 4,000 remain. Their ethnic cleansing was the largest displacement of non-Muslims until the exodus of Christians from Iraq after 2003. There were more Jewish refugees than Palestinian refugees, 850,000 as against 711,000 according to UN figures. You can count the Jews in these countries on the fingers of 1 or 2 hands. Some have no Jews at all. Yet in the reams written about the Arab-Israeli conflict, it is rare to find any mention of Jewish refugees or the end of their millennial civilization. Why has this silent and forced exodus, one of the most dramatic of the last 70 years, gone unnoticed, while the Palestinian refugee narrative hogs the limelight? Before we go into the reasons why, I would like to take you back in history. Jews have lived in the region before there were any Arabs or Turks, 1,000 years before Islam, after the 7th century Arab conquest, together with other indigenous people, Berbers, Kurds, Copts, and Assyrians. Jews were subject to currents of Arabization and Islamization. There were times when minorities flourished, but like Christians, Jews became inferior dhimmis under Islamic rule. This status gave non-Muslims few rights. They were allowed to practice their religion as long as they forfeited their right to self-defense on payment of a tax. The colonial period gave Jews Western education and greater security. Many thrived. But the 20th century also saw the rise of Nazi-inspired nationalism and Islamism. The Arab world imported European ideas of Jewish conspiracy and control. The Palestinian Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, collaborated with the Nazis. He planned to kill the Jews wherever he found them, not just in Palestine, but across the Arab world. In May 1948, 7 Arab League states declared war against the fledgling state of Israel. The New York Times reported that they declared a second war against their own Jewish citizens, branded the Jewish minority of Palestine. Mizrahi Jews, as they were later known, were conflated with Israelis, though they were non-combatants thousands of miles away. Zionism became a crime. This meant you could be arrested, jailed, tried, and executed on the flimsiest of pretexts. Billions were extorted or stolen from Jews in property and assets. Violence broke out and hundreds of Jews were killed in riots. Jews were hostages to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Eventually, Israel mounted dramatic rescue missions, and the majority, 650,000, mostly destitute refugees, fled to Israel, doubling the Jewish population overnight. 200,000, including my family, resettled in the West. But the story remains forgotten or ignored. I will set out some of the reasons. Number one, the Jewish refugees were never on the international peace agenda. They were absorbed into Israel. The Palestinian refugees were not integrated into Arab states, but were deliberately left as a standing reproach to Israel. The UN established 10 agencies to care for Palestinian refugees. Their numbers ballooned to over 5 million because uniquely refugee status could be passed on from generation to generation. The UN General Assembly passed 172 resolutions mentioning Palestinian refugees. None mentions Jewish refugees. The Security Council passed 10 resolutions. None mentions Jewish refugees. Number two, Arab denial. Arab states deny that Jews were forced out of their countries. Palestinians would no longer be seen as sole victims. Acknowledging the Jewish exodus would imply recognizing their responsibility for it. So they say that Jews left of their own free will. Many deny that Jews ever lived in their countries, and there's less and less historical evidence of Jewish heritage. Here is Ezekiel's shrine in Iraq, which has been transformed into a mosque. Others insist that thousands still remain in Arab lands. If Arabs admit that an exodus took place, they blame the Zionists for causing it. They blame Israel for ruining a harmonious relationship that prevailed before the Jewish state was established. But sporadic outbreaks of violence, such as the Farhud in 1941 and the Constantine massacre in 1934, are proof that all was not always well, and the fact that other minorities with no Israel have been persecuted points to an inability to tolerate difference. Jewish denial is another reason. Jews were, by the UN definition, refugees, having a well-founded fear of persecution. They did not remain refugees for long because their adopted countries gave them full civil rights. In other words, the problem was solved, although the human rights abuses and dispossession they suffered remain unresolved injustices. Jews wanted to forget the past. They rebuilt their lives. Those in Israel were embarrassed to compare their plight with that of Holocaust survivors. Nostalgia has served to distort the historical record. And some Jews act as ambassadors and advisors. For instance, André Azoulay, as you see here in the picture, who is a royal advisor to the King of Morocco. Another factor, Israel denial. Israel did not see them as refugees, but as Zionists returning to their ancestral homeland. It did not want to drive a wedge between different communities. It wanted to forge a new Israeli citizen speaking Hebrew. To some extent, this melting pot policy has worked. But in terms of public diplomacy, Israel's failure to raise awareness of the Jewish refugees has been a disaster. Tommy Lapid, father of the present prime minister, called it one of the greatest blunders in the state's history. The Palestinian narrative became a cause célèbre, while Israel stayed silent about its refugees. It was only in the early 21st century that Israel made justice for Jewish refugees a plank of its foreign policy, and the impetus came mainly from outside and was driven by Ashkenazi human rights lawyers such as Erwin Kotler. Ashkenormativity, another factor. The issue has failed to become mainstream in Israel. This is due to widespread public ignorance. In a recent poll, only 7% of respondents could identify the Farhud, an Iraqi pogrom in which hundreds of Jews were slaughtered in 1941, whereas 58% could correctly identify Kristallnacht. The media and academia remained dominated by Ashkenazim. The exodus from Arab countries was not their story. Their background was the Shoah. Ignorance of the Jewish exodus leads some to espouse the Arab narrative that the exodus of Palestinian refugees, or Nakba, ought to be compared to the catastrophe of the Shoah. Logically, the Arab Nakba should be juxtaposed with the contemporaneous Jewish Nakba, a consequence of Arab and Muslim anti-Semitism. Interfaith and coexistence initiatives almost always skirt around difficult subjects and never mention the exodus. Social justice warriors are more concerned with Arab rights than Mizrahi rights. The left frequently considers the Jewish refugee issue an obstacle to peace. To talk of Muslim or Arab racism invites charges of Islamophobia. Even institutes like Yad Vashem are willing to distort history for political reasons, for example, by minimizing the wartime mufti's collaboration with Nazism. And this picture you see here was actually dropped from the newly designed building, Yad Vashem, in the 1990s. Another factor, the counter-narrative on the left, describing Jews as Arab Jews. In a projection of Edward Said's division of the world into the West versus the rest, an anti-Zionist far left, led by academics like Ella Shohat on the far right of the picture, with little or no direct experience of living in an Arab country, have fabricated the Arab Jew counter-narrative in order to use Mizrahi Jews as a weapon against Israel. They claim that Mizrahi Jews are Arabs of the Jewish faith, oppressed by white Ashkenazi Jews and torn away from their Arab brethren. The exodus is almost always ignored or blamed on Zionism or colonialism or both, but almost no Mizrahim identify as Arab Jews. Their memory of persecution in Arab countries created a legacy of hurt, bitterness, and mistrust. This experience, I would argue, more than resentment of Israel's labor-dominated establishment, explains why they vote for right-wing parties. In the words of the great Tunisian Jewish writer Albert Memmi, we would have liked to be Arab Jews if we abandoned the idea it is because over the centuries the Muslim Arabs systematically prevented its realization by their contempt and cruelty. Anti-Semitism should place Jews in the category of oppressed people of color, but in the fashionable social hierarchy, Jews generally are deemed white and privileged. Identity politics hold that people of color cannot be oppressors, only victims. There is no space in progressive politics for Jews from Arab countries, even though they are people of color par excellence who have been oppressed by other people of color. To conclude, the Jewish exodus must not be suppressed. It is the key to understanding the Middle East. Over 50% of the Jews of Israel descend from Jewish refugees or are themselves refugees from Arab and Muslim countries. In the words of Matti Friedman, they are in Israel not because of the Nazis, but because of the Arabs. A peace agreement which does not take account of the Jewish refugees will not be based on truth. As in other countries, between Turkey and Greece and India and Pakistan, the Middle East conflict produced two sets of refugees, roughly equal numbers exchanged places in Palestine. Neither group is going back. Restoring the Jewish refugees to the historical record is the key to peace and reconciliation. Thank you very much.